What's up, you guys? Dr. Goodin back with another lecture about periodization. This is part 2 in our periodization series from the CSCS textbook, chapter 21. Today we're going to be talking about some key terms and phases within the periodization structure. So what does macrocycle and mesocycle and microcycle even mean, and how does it correspond with the typical season structure for most of the team athletes that we will be working with? Now, all of this information comes from Chapter 21 from the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, put out by the NSCA, written by Dr. Haff. So some key terms. First up is the macrocycle. A macrocycle is typically an entire training year, but it can range from several months up to 4 years, which is also called a quadrennial or a quadrennial cycle. So especially in the developmental portion of most athletes' lives, they are on 4-year blocks, such as high school is typically 4 years, and then the collegiate system in the US is typically 4 years, sometimes 5 if you redshirt. And then, of course, the Olympics come up every 4 years as well, whether it's the Winter Olympics or the Summer Olympics. So it makes sense to structure the grand scheme of training on those 4-year cycles at the absolute maximum. But then, of course, a macrocycle can be as short as several months. Let's say if you have a 2-season sport athlete, maybe a soccer player who also does basketball or something like that. They may have 2 different macrocycles, one for basketball and one for soccer. So we talked about macrocycles. Next, we need to talk about mesocycles, and typically there are 2 or more mesocycles within the macrocycle, each lasting several weeks to several months. Sometimes these are called blocks, but other times we think of blocks as making up a mesocycle. So a little bit confusing there in common terminology. Mesocycle and block is sometimes interchangeable as the same sort of amount of time. Other times, it depends on who you're talking to and what literature you're reading. Other times, blocks of training stacked on top of each other or in sequence make up a mesocycle, which in turn, several mesocycles make up a macrocycle. So again, don't get confused there. They can sometimes be interchangeable, sometimes they mean different things. Now, microcycles last anywhere from a couple days up to 2 weeks. Most commonly, they last 7 days. And the reason for that is because most people's calendars revolve around the 7-day work week. It just makes sense. You work 5 days and then you rest for 2 days and then you repeat. And that's how most training programs go. Not that you necessarily rest on the weekends, just that they reset every 7 days so that it aligns predictably with the rest of the things in an athlete's life. Now, a professional athlete may have fewer outside commitments, such as a 9-to-5 job that would tie them to the 7-day microcycle. And in those cases, they could do maybe a 10-day microcycle where the training stimulus repeats every 10 days. So let's say on day 1, you have an aerobic day. Day 2 is a day off. Day 3 is a strength and power day. Day 4 is a day off. Day 5 is a regen day, etc. I'm just kind of making this up. Not that it would be necessarily beneficial to sequence it like that, but you get what I'm saying. And then after 10 days, the whole system repeats itself. But now you're no longer starting on, let's say, the same day of the week. Maybe that 10-day microcycle started on a Monday the first time. The next day, it's going to start on Monday plus 3 extra days. Okay, so it gets confusing for us normal folks to use more than a 7-day microcycle or less than one. That's why most microcycles are 7 days. Now, we need to talk about the classical periodization periods. Periodized training programs systematically shift training foci, or is it foci? I don't know if that C is soft or hard. Let me know in the comments what you think. And while you're doing that, go ahead and give this video a like, a thumbs up. I usually don't do that in the middle of my videos, but here I am doing it. I'm a YouTuber now. They shift training foci from general non-specific activities of high volume and low intensity toward activities of lower volume and higher intensities over a period of many weeks or months. And we're going to see a graph showing that here in a second. This helps to reduce the potential for overtraining while optimizing performance capacities. So let's see what that looks like. This is from Matveyev's classical periodization model. And this is appropriate for novice and CGS sport athletes. CGS sports standing for centimeter gram second sports. So think of track and field, or athletics as you call it in the rest of the world. In more individual sports where the idea is to run as fast or as far or jump as high or throw as far as possible. Now let's take a look at this graph. What we see on the y-axis, we have kind of a triple y-axis here. Essentially, the y-axis is just the quantity of either volume, intensity, or technique. Okay, and then we see the x-axis going this way is time, and we have the different phases that we're going to talk about: preparation phase, first transition, competition phase, and second transition. We'll talk about those here in a minute. But as you go from the start of the preparation phase, we have very low technique work because we're pretty far out from competition. This low technique work gives us more time for a high volume of training. And the intensity has to be moderate to low because you cannot handle a super high volume of also super intense training, right? That would lead to burnout or, at the very worst, overtraining syndrome, which is what we don't want. Now, as we get closer to competition and we enter the first transition period, which is typically where the preseason starts, now we start to add in more time spent on technique training and tactical training. So we see this curve go up here. Intensity starts to ramp up as well, and the volume starts to drop. And the volume starts to drop so that we can dissipate some of that fatigue that we were developing during the off season. It also drops because the training focus shifts away from work capacity and hypertrophy and more towards strength and power development. Now, as we cross the threshold over into the competition phase, now technique work is getting very high and indeed is becoming more of the primary focus of training, whereas the volume is dropping, continuing to drop, because we want to continue to dissipate fatigue and make sure that those athletes arrive at the game or the match or the race ready to go and refreshed. Intensity of training, however, can start to be much higher. Because those volumes are lower, we need the intensities to be higher, not only to maintain the gains that we've made, but to capitalize on those gains. Remember that in periodization, the previous cycle or phase of training or block of training is supposed to potentiate the current phase of training. And so by developing better work capacity and potentially adding in some hypertrophy to sport-specific muscle fibers and motor units, hopefully we have potentiated the ability to gain strength and then express power as we are training at higher intensities. Now, as we get to the end of the competition phase, this is probably where those key events are taking place. We have a very high focus on technique, very high intensities and very low volumes. And then the competition period ends, we have our last match or the final race or the championship, and then we go into the second transition, which is where all of the curves start to go back down and we enter a period of planned rest. So let's talk through each of these periods in order. So that preparatory period that I mentioned, now this is the first and usually the longest period. However, if let's say a lot of our youth athletes, if you're like a youth athlete and you play year-round sports, then unfortunately there's not very much of a preparatory period to be had, which is one reason for long-term athlete development. Check out chapter 7, I think, in the textbook, and I have a video that talks about that as well, why it's not good to specialize in year-round sports. We need that time away and that time to build up our biomotor abilities so that we can continue to stay healthy as we play our sport to the highest level. Now, this occurs during the time of the year when there are no competitions and tactical, technical, and sport-specific work is limited. So in the off-season is not a good time to be really honing in on drills and techniques for the sport if you are already an advanced level athlete. Now, for youth athletes, that's totally fine as long as they're also mixing it up with other things, because like an 8-year-old is not going to be working on super high velocity, very technical game speed skills. They're going to be like learning how to dribble. So some of this doesn't necessarily apply all the way down to the youth levels. The major emphasis during the preparatory period should focus on establishing a base level of conditioning to increase the athlete's tolerance for more intense training. So have you ever heard of the term base building? I'm sure you have. It is a carryover kind of from endurance training, where runners would spend the summer building up their base mileage. Now, for most athletes, we want to get away from that thinking where we're just thinking about endurance training and sort of conditioning for all of our athletes as a blanket statement. Think of this base level of conditioning as very sport specific. So if you're a power lifter, in your off season, your work capacity or base building phase is about building a base level of general strength, not of general endurance. If you are a soccer athlete, you need general athleticism, you need repeated sprint ability, you need aerobic ability, all of it in a very general nature without touching a ball, or with touching a ball less frequently than when you're in the competition phase. Now, during the preparatory period, during this mesocycle, there are a few specific blocks of training that we should, or at least should consider incorporating in the weight room. The first is a hypertrophy or strength endurance phase. This is comprised of low to moderate intensity, 50 to 75% of the 1RM, and high volumes, so 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 20 repetitions. And 8 to 20 repetitions is right there in that hypertrophic range for stimulating muscle growth because of the ability to load it heavily, but also to have higher repetitions and get more effective reps per set. So lots of time under tension and good stretch on the muscle and good metabolite accumulation. All of those things will drive hypertrophy. It's also a good time for basic strength work. These are higher intensities, so 80 to 95% of the 1RM, and moderate to high volume. So you can't always train with quite as high volume in a strength phase because those intensities are higher. We're thinking something like 2 to 6 sets of 2 to 6 repetitions. And again, 2 to 6 repetitions is right in the middle of that strength range as far as repetitions go. Probably if we're talking about the preparatory period and a basic strength phase, we want to stay maybe more like 3 to 6. I would say even like 4 to 6 repetitions. 2 is just very low. After that preparatory period, we have the first transition period. This is the linkage between the preparatory period and the competition period. This is where we start to focus on the elevation of strength and power as we transition from base building and into putting some of those fitness characteristics to the test in competition. But in between there, we have to convert, right? So if we've built up our work capacity and our muscle size, well, now we have to teach those muscles to be stronger and more powerful so that they can apply more directly to our explosiveness or our sprint ability on game day. So the typical phase of training or block of training that we would implement is a strength/power phase or a strength and power phase. These are low up to very high loads. So we're training at both ends of the force velocity curve, both ends of that spectrum. So all the way down to 30% of 1RM where power is maximized in certain movements like the squat jump, up to 95% of 1RM, maybe in the Olympic lifts, maybe in movements like the back squat or the front squat or the bench press. And we train with low volumes, 2 to 5 sets of 2 to 5 repetitions. And we want lower volumes because we want the fatigue that was generated during the preparatory period to really start to dissipate. Remember the fitness fatigue paradigm. Preparedness is maximized when fatigue dissipates, but fitness remains high. Next, we have the competitive period. Now, during the competitive period, all of the games and matches happen and the athletes are experiencing a lot of fatigue from match play or from game day, especially in the collegiate system, sometimes in the high school system. For instance, right now I'm working with the women's soccer team here at Point Loma and they have matches twice a week. And for our starters, that's a lot of work, 2 90-minute games. And, we hold them back on the second game a little bit or save them in the first game so they can play the full game in the second game. But even then, that's a lot of high-speed running and contacts and tackles that are occurring. So there's a lot to recover from. So during that competitive period, oftentimes with team sport athletes, we do our best to maintain the qualities that we've built, but we don't necessarily try to gain any more. So we're not overloading them in the weight room. The sessions are short and they are effective and they're moderate to high intensities, but no more than 30 to 40 minutes once or twice a week, just so that we can maintain those qualities. Now, for maintenance, athletes should use moderate to high intensity, so 85 to 93% of 1RM with moderate volumes. And for peaking, we want to use very high to low intensity, so somewhat similar to a strength and power phase, 50 up to above 93% of the 1RM, with very, very low volume, so just 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 repetitions. Now, after the competitive period is done, we enter the second transition phase. This is also called active rest. This occurs after the competitive season and before the next Macrocycles preparatory period, and it's also called active rest or restoration. This provides a period of time in which the athletes can rehabilitate injuries and refresh both physically and mentally before beginning a new annual training plan or macrocycle. So this is just that time when you recoup from injuries, when you take some time off, when you go for leisurely swims or go for walks or go on a hike, or you play badminton for fun instead of powerlifting, or do some CrossFit classes with somewhat low intensities and very good technique for fun instead of going to soccer practice. It's just general healthy living for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, so that both physically and mentally the athlete can recover from that long season that they just finished. So how do we apply the classical periodization periods to team sport seasons? Well, the off season aligns with the preparatory period that we talked about. This is between the end of the postseason and the beginning of the preseason. Again, there are no competitions, so this is the ideal time to develop size, strength, and work capacity in most of our athletes who need that. In endurance athletes, it's an ideal time to ramp up the mileage and enhance the endurance components. The preseason aligns with the first transition period. This is the end of the off-season. Oftentimes it's when athletes get back to campus or back to training camp, and it leads up to the first contest. With competition looming, the focus should be on strength and power. Now, this is a little bit different than a lot of teams in, say, the collegiate system, where when they get back to campus, there's 3-a-days and they're hitting the ground running, and the work capacity, the volume of training goes through the roof. That may or may not be ideal. Probably better to have been more slowly and gradually building up training volume over the summer and then sustaining it and dropping it a little bit before they get back to campus. But you can't always regulate that as the coach or the strength coach in the collegiate system. Next, we have in-season, which aligns with the competition period. And again, this contains all the contests scheduled for that year, including any tournaments. Most sports have a long season that requires multiple mesocycles arranged around key contests. So if the season lasts 2 or 3 months, then oftentimes we need specific mesocycles and perhaps return to fitness weeks or chunks within those mesocycles to make sure that we're not declining in all of our fitness qualities. For instance, let's say that you have a soccer team and they have matches for 3 or 4 weeks, 2 matches per week. Well, that's a really good time to have just a maintenance block. But then maybe they have a bye week and they have no match for 2 weeks. That's a great time to inject a concentrated load to return them to fitness, maybe a 5x5 or a 6x5 at 80 to 85% of 1RM, so we can regain a little bit of that lost strength and hypertrophy and then carry it through the rest of the season. Then finally, we have the postseason, which of course aligns with the second transition period. And this is that time for active rest before beginning the next year's off season. And here we have a picture of all of these different periods and seasons aligned. At the top, we have the annual training plan, which is also called the macrocycle, which is divided up into the preparatory period, competition period, and transition period. And then Doctors Stone, O'Brien, and Garhammer added in the terminology for that. Here it says second transition period, but this figure is wrong. It should say first transition period. First. I'll have to email the editor about that mistake because this comes from the textbook. And then we have the seasonal term, so off-season, preseason, in-season, and postseason. And then finally, the training focus. Okay, so if these are the mesocycles, then these down here would be the blocks of training. And within these blocks of training would be individual microcycles. So these blocks, what these stand for are hypertrophy, basic strength, back to hypertrophy, back to basic strength, right? So we're alternating between them just so that we don't get stale in training any of those qualities. We grow the muscles bigger, then we teach them to be strong, then we take those newly strengthened muscles and grow them a bit again and then teach them to be strong. Then we have active rest right here. I don't know if I would necessarily include active rest right before starting the preseason, but maybe at least a week or 2 weeks of a deload, and then into strength and power, basic strength, strength and power, then into maintenance during the season, and then finally active rest again during the postseason. And that, folks, is all of the key terminology, well, not all of it, but most of it for periodization. Now, in parts 1, we talked about the underlying concepts. In this video, we talked about the terms. In the next video, we are going to design a periodized program from start to finish for 1, maybe 2 different athletes. So we'll do that in Excel. We'll use the information from these 2 chapters to do so. So you're going to want to stick around and see that. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments below. It was great being with you today. Thank you for watching the video. Let me know if it was helpful to you by giving it a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Dr. Goodin here, back in the lecture.
At the bell.
Here we go.
Experiment.